The sound was sharp, sudden, and completely out of place. A dry metallic snap, followed by a violent thwack as something invisible slammed into steel. For a split second, the room froze. Grown men in heavy suits stopped breathing. Cigars burned unattended between their fingers. Nobody in that boardroom had expected power to sound like that, because that sound wasn't supposed to exist. It didn't come from a factory floor or a battlefield or a machine shop. It came from a small, strange device sitting on a polished wooden table in a dying company's headquarters. And with that single noise, something ancient inside America quietly shifted. It was the moment a nation accidentally invented its most influential childhood weapon. Not as a toy, not as a product, but as a mistake. A mistake that would end an entire industry, reshape how generations of boys learned about danger, and plant the idea that power should fit in small hands. And the men who heard it had no idea they were listening to the future. Because just seconds earlier, they were convinced they were about to lose everything. The men sitting around the table that day were not dreamers. They were not inventors. They were industrial realists who dealt in iron, weight, and brutal math. Their company was called the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company, and for years they had believed they were building the backbone of rural America. Their product wasn't glamorous. It was massive towers of cast iron and steel designed to stand alone in empty fields and pull water from deep underground. These windmills were engineering masterpieces, overbuilt, nearly indestructible. The kind of machines meant to survive storms, decades, even generations. But that was exactly the problem. They were too heavy, too permanent, too expensive to move in a country that was still stitched together by dirt roads and rail lines. Every windmill had to be shipped piece by piece from a small industrial town just outside Detroit, and the cost of transport was quietly killing the business. The books didn't lie. Every sale barely broke even. Some lost money outright. Warehouses filled with unsold iron. Capital was frozen in metal that refused to move. The very strength of the product had become its weakness. Inside the boardroom, nobody talked about innovation anymore. They talked about survival. About how long before the stockholders pulled out. About how many months of payroll were left. About whether the factory would still exist by winter. They had built machines meant to last 100 years, but the company itself might not survive one more. And that was when a watchmaker walked through the door carrying something that weighed less than a toolbox, but would end up outweighing every windmill they had ever built. The man who walked into that collapsing boardroom didn't look like a savior. He wasn't dressed like an executive or an engineer. He wasn't carrying blueprints or financial projections. He was a watchmaker named Clarence Hamilton, a quiet tinkerer who spent most of his life surrounded by gears, springs, and tiny mechanical parts. Under his arm, he carried a long bundle wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. He didn't explain himself. He didn't pitch a product. He simply laid it on the table, unwrapped the fabric, and revealed something none of the men in the room had ever seen before. It looked like a rifle, but not quite. The body was skeletal, made of metal tubing instead of carved wood. The mechanism was exposed, almost naked. It wasn't elegant or decorative like the air guns wealthy Europeans kept as parlor curiosities. This thing looked industrial, functional, built to be used, not admired. At the time, air rifles were toys for rich hobbyists. Delicate, complicated, expensive to manufacture, and easy to break. Hamilton's version was the opposite. Entirely metal, brutally simple, designed to be stamped, assembled, and sold for a fraction of the cost. Without asking for permission, Hamilton stood up, walked to the corner of the room, and pointed the barrel at a wire wastebasket overflowing with crumpled paper. The men didn't stop him. They were too curious. He pulled a lever. There was a tight mechanical resistance, the sound of a spring being forced into tension. The room went silent. Then he pulled the trigger. Thwack! A small steel ball exploded out of the barrel and punched straight through the paper, rattling violently against the metal mesh. It wasn't a soft sound. It wasn't playful. It sounded sharp, final, almost aggressive. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the general manager, Lewis Cass Huff, stood up, walked over, picked up the strange device, and fired it himself. Another thwack. Same force, same authority. He looked at Hamilton, eyes wide, and said the sentence that would accidentally rename American childhood. Boy, that's a daisy. In the slang of the time, a daisy meant perfection, the best of its kind, the highest compliment a man could give. But in that moment, it wasn't just praise. It was a baptism. A dying windmill company had just been given a new identity, and no one in that room realized they had just named a weapon that would end up in the hands of millions of children. At first, nobody at the company thought they had just discovered their future. To them, Hamilton's air rifle was a novelty. A clever little machine, sure, but nothing compared to the towering iron structures they were still trying to sell. They were windmill men. They didn't understand toys. They didn't understand entertainment, and they definitely didn't understand children as a market. But they understood one thing very clearly. They were running out of money. So they did what desperate companies always do. They improvised. Instead of retooling the factory or betting everything on an unproven invention, they used the rifle as bait, a sweetener, a bribe. The offer was simple. Buy a Plymouth iron windmill, and you get a Daisy air rifle for free. No extra charge. A bonus for the farmer. The logic made sense on paper. A man buys the windmill for his crops, takes the rifle home, gives it to his son, maybe uses it himself to scare birds off the fields. Everybody wins. But when the salesman came back from the countryside, something strange started happening. The farmers weren't asking about the windmills. They weren't asking about water output or blade efficiency or installation costs. They were asking about the gun, over and over again. The same question. How much for the rifle? Could they buy just the rifle? What if they didn't want the windmill at all? Some deals collapsed entirely because the farmer didn't care about the iron tower. He only wanted the small steel weapon. Others walked away unless the rifle was included. A few even tried to negotiate the windmill price down just to get the free gun. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The thing meant to be the bonus had become the product. The thing meant to be the product had become the obstacle. A few pounds of steel tubing and a spring had outperformed a machine that took entire train cars to transport. Without meaning to, the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company had uncovered something far more powerful than agriculture. They had stumbled into a deep, primal desire. The urge to aim, to hit, to control something at a distance. And once that instinct was exposed, there was no going back. By the mid-1890s, the truth had become impossible to deny. The windmills were dead weight. The rifles were the future. And the board of directors was finally forced to admit what the farmers already knew. They hadn't built a better farm tool. They had built something people wanted. So they did something almost unheard of in industrial America. They didn't slowly diversify. They didn't create a side division. They didn't hedge their bets. They shut down the very thing that had given them their identity. The blast furnaces that once melted iron for agricultural towers were retooled to cast small steel components. The yards that had stored windmill blades were cleared to make room for crates of ammunition. The same factory that had built machines meant to survive tornadoes was now focused on building weapons small enough to fit in a child's hands. In 1895, the company officially changed its name. The word windmill disappeared forever. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company became the Daisy Manufacturing Company. This wasn't an evolution, it was a mutation. A heavy industrial firm, born in soot and steel, had transformed overnight into a company selling childhood power fantasies. But they didn't know how to make toys. They only knew how to make tools. So they built the rifles the only way they understood, out of real materials. Heavy gauge steel, solid wood stocks, springs designed by machinists who were used to building equipment meant to last decades. These weren't plastic playthings or delicate novelties. They were industrial machines that had simply been scaled down. When you picked up an early Daisy rifle, it didn't feel safe. It felt serious. It had weight. It smelled like oil and metal. The trigger required real pressure. The edges were sharp enough to remind you this wasn't a cartoon object. It wasn't designed to protect the child from the world. It was designed to introduce the child to it. Daisy didn't see themselves as making toys. They saw themselves as forging discipline, teaching boys how mechanisms worked, how force worked, how consequences worked. They believed that if you could master steel, you could master yourself. And without realizing it, they had just created the most controversial object in American childhood. Because the next step wasn't just selling rifles. It was turning them into a national myth. By the late 1930s, Daisy had the factory, the philosophy, and the audience. But what they didn't have yet was a legend. They needed something bigger than steel and springs. They needed a story that could live inside a child's head. They found it in a comic strip. It was called Red Ryder, and it ran in newspapers across the country. The character wasn't a singing movie cowboy or a cartoon hero. He was rough, quiet, competent. A working cowboy who solved problems with calm precision and a rifle that never missed. He represented everything American masculinity was supposed to be at the time: independence, skill, moral clarity. Daisy didn't just want to license the name. They wanted to build the comic into physical reality. A gun that didn't feel like a toy inspired by Red Ryder, but like Red Ryder's actual rifle. In 1938, they released it, the Daisy Red Ryder, and it became the most important object in the history of American play. This thing wasn't light. It weighed nearly 3 pounds. The barrel and receiver were heavy blued steel. The stock was a solid slab of real hardwood, stained dark and warm, with the cowboy's image literally burned into the side like a brand on cattle. It wasn't printed. It was scorched, permanent. But the real magic was the lever. To cock the gun, a boy had to brace it against his hip, grab the metal loop, and crank it forward with force. It made a loud mechanical click-clack sound as the spring locked into tension. That sound mattered. It told your brain something real had just happened. This wasn't pretend anymore. They even added a saddle ring on the side of the receiver. A real metal ring with a leather thong. It served no practical purpose at all, but it made the gun feel like it belonged on a horse, not in a toy box. It told the child this object came from the frontier, from work, from danger. The ammunition wasn't foam. It wasn't rubber. It was .177 caliber steel BBS coated in copper. Cold, heavy. When you poured them into your hand, they sounded like rain on a tin roof. When you loaded them into the rifle, you knew exactly what you were holding. Small pieces of real metal moving at real speed. 300 feet per second. Enough to shatter bottles. Enough to dent metal. Enough to break windows. Enough to hurt someone if you were careless. And that was the point. The Red Ryder launched at the exact moment the world was sliding toward war. As fathers were being shipped off to Europe and the Pacific carrying real rifles, their sons were patrolling backyards and barns with Daisy versions. The fantasy wasn't separate from reality. It was a rehearsal. Daisy leaned into this completely. Their ads didn't talk about fun. They talked about marksmanship, discipline, responsibility. They published shooting manuals, partnered with the Boy Scouts, taught kids how to build basement firing ranges, not to avoid danger, but to manage it. If you had a Red Ryder in the 1940s or 50s, you weren't just playing. You were inducted. It was a rite of passage. The moment your parents trusted you with real power. The moment childhood ended and training began. Entire neighborhoods revolved around it. Tin cans on fences, bottles on logs, targets pinned to trees. The boy with the best aim became king. The boy without a BB gun didn't exist socially at all. The factory in Plymouth ran non-stop. Millions of rifles, generations of workers assembling steel and wood by hand. They weren't building toys. They believed they were building men. And for a while, it worked. The Red Ryder became more than a product. It became the physical symbol of American boyhood. The smell of gun oil, the stiffness of the lever, the tiny kick against your shoulder, the golden streak of a BB flying through the air. It felt real because it was real. But the world that created that feeling was already starting to disappear. And the next generation wouldn't be trusted with steel at all. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no single law, no dramatic ban, no announcement that childhood had officially been declared too dangerous. It happened quietly, the way cultural revolutions always do. Through statistics, through lawsuits, through headlines about injuries instead of heroics. By the late 1950s, the America that had trusted boys with steel was starting to flinch. Newspapers began running stories about eye injuries. Doctors warned about projectiles. Insurance companies started paying attention. And a new character entered the story for the first time: the lawyer. At the same time, the economics were collapsing from the inside. The Plymouth factory was old. The machines were aging. The unions in Michigan were strong and expensive. Wages rose, benefits rose, liability rose. And suddenly, the cathedral of industry that had built the Red Ryder looked less like a triumph and more like a financial risk. So Daisy did what American corporations were learning to do in the post-war era. They ran from history. In closed-door meetings, executives studied maps instead of blueprints. They found a small town in the Ozarks called Rogers, Arkansas. Cheap land, cheap labor, no unions, no legacy, just efficiency. In 1958, the announcement was made. Daisy was leaving Plymouth. To the town, it felt like betrayal. The men on those assembly lines weren't just workers. They were craftsmen. They knew how to temper springs so they wouldn't snap in winter, how to cut wood grain so it resisted splitting, They carried knowledge passed down through generations of steel and sawdust. Knowledge that couldn't be automated or documented. And overnight, it became worthless. The stamping presses were unbolted from concrete floors they had occupied since the 19th century. Tooling was crated. Molds were shipped south. The machines left. The skills stayed behind. The workers were given severance checks and silence. The new factory in Arkansas was cleaner, faster, more modern, and completely different in spirit. This wasn't a place built to last a century. It was built to minimize cost, maximize volume, and reduce legal exposure. And that's when the lawyers took over the design room. The Consumer Product Safety Commission arrived in the 1970s with a simple message: make it safer, or we'll make it disappear. Lawn darts were banned, chemistry sets were neutered, and the BB gun was next. So Daisy started stripping away everything that made the Red Ryder real. The springs were weakened. The velocity was reduced. The triggers were redesigned to feel soft and mushy. The engineers who once competed to make the guns shoot harder were now competing to make them legally harmless. But the true betrayal came with the material itself. For decades, the soul of the Red Ryder had been wood, solid American hardwood. Warm, heavy, alive. When you held it, it felt like a tool, not a toy. It demanded care. Oil it. Don't leave it wet. Don't drop it. Wood taught responsibility through maintenance. The new management saw something else. They saw splinters, weight, shipping costs, lawsuits. So they replaced it with plastic. They called it a durable composite, molded fake grain, painted brown, hollow inside. When you tapped it with your fingernail, it didn't make a solid sound. It made a cheap, empty clack. Two plastic halves glued together with a seam running straight down the middle. A visible scar of mass production. A wooden rifle is a weapon. A plastic rifle is a toy. And that single material change rewired the entire meaning of the object. The barrel metal got thinner. The lever became flimsy stamped sheet metal. The saddle ring turned into decorative nonsense. The gun still looked like a Red Ryder from a distance, but in your hands, it felt like a lie. The danger was gone, and with it, the respect. The lawyers celebrated. The accountants celebrated. Profits went up. Lawsuits went down. But something essential had been amputated. They hadn't just made the gun safer. They had made it meaningless. The final blow didn't come from a courtroom or a factory. It came from a living room. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a new kind of weapon entered American childhood. It didn't fire steel. It didn't use springs or levers or oil. It plugged into a television. The Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, later the PlayStation. Gray plastic boxes that offered something no backyard ever could. Infinite targets, infinite ammo, zero consequences. The bridge between the old world and the new was a gun that looked familiar but felt completely empty. The Duck Hunt Zapper. Neon orange, lightweight, no recoil, no projectile. You pulled the trigger and a beam of light hit a screen. Nothing moved in the real world. Nothing could break. Nothing could hurt you. It was marksmanship without physics, shooting without weight, violence without risk. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. First came Doom, then GoldenEye, then Call of Duty. Entire genres built around digital weapons that never jammed, never missed, and never taught restraint. You didn't learn to breathe or steady your hands. You learned to spray, to respawn, to reload instantly. The old Daisy boy had to walk outside. had to set up cans, had to retrieve targets, had to accept gravity, wind, and failure. He learned that every shot cost effort. Every mistake had a consequence. If he missed, the BB hit a fence. If he wasn't careful, he broke something real. The new digital child learned something else entirely: that mistakes could be erased, that violence was reversible, that power required no discipline because it existed only as pixels. The relationship flipped. The Red Ryder taught kids they were dangerous and needed control. Video games taught kids they were harmless and could reset reality. Daisy tried to follow the trend. They released tactical plastic rifles, fake military designs with rails, scopes, and gamer aesthetics. But it was a losing battle. They were trying to sell physical tools to a generation that only wanted simulations. The backyard disappeared. The tin can disappeared. The sound of steel hitting steel disappeared. And the BB gun, once the symbol of growing up, became a strange relic, something you found hanging in a big box store between camping chairs and fishing lures. Not a rite of passage, just another product, a ghost from a world where power had weight, and weight meant responsibility. The Plymouth factory didn't vanish in a fire or an explosion. It didn't die dramatically. It was simply left behind. For decades after Daisy packed up and left Michigan, the massive brick complex on Union Street stood there like a corpse that nobody wanted to bury. Windows shattered, roof sagging, weeds growing through concrete where stamping presses once shook the ground. The building wasn't haunted by ghosts in sheets. It was haunted by something heavier, by the absence of noise. If you stood outside the chain-link fence on a quiet afternoon, you could almost hear it. The phantom rhythm of drop forges, the hiss of welding torches, the mechanical heartbeat of a town that used to build real things. And when the demolition crews finally arrived, they weren't just removing an abandoned structure. They were erasing the physical evidence of a worldview. The belief that children could handle reality, that they could be trusted with weight, risk, and consequence. Because what really died wasn't a factory. It was a philosophy. The original Red Ryder wasn't special because it was a gun. It was special because it was honest. It didn't pretend the world was soft. It didn't lie about power. It taught a simple lesson. If you hold something dangerous, you must become disciplined enough to control it. Steel demanded respect. Wood demanded care. Miss a shot, and something real happened. But we replaced that teacher. First with plastic, then with pixels, then with screens that glow and reset every mistake with a button press. We created a world where nothing has weight, where triggers have no resistance, where consequences are optional. The ghosts of the Plymouth factory aren't restless because their building was destroyed. They're restless because their idea was abandoned. They believed a child could face reality. We decided reality was too risky. So the wind still blows across the empty lot where blast furnaces once roared. But there's no sound anymore. No metallic thwack. No steel hitting tin. Just the silent hum of a billion screens playing a game where nobody ever really learns how to aim.